Is it weird coming back to Final Fantasy 14 after playing WoW Classic for a little while? I need to tell you guys something, to be fair, that I mean, I've been playing 14 now for a little over 3 years. I mainly played a large bulk of it throughout COVID, which I think was Shadowbringers going into Endwalker. And I kind of just haven't really left this game alone. It's always sort of had its vices on me. I recently tried out Classic WoW, the 20th anniversary servers, and my God, I mean, it's not until you go back that you realize quite how much things have changed, not just within WoW and 14, but in the gaming space in general, and some of it for the better and some of it arguably for the worse. The thing is, for me, Classic WoW has given me such a better perspective of Final Fantasy 14 and ultimately some of the more modern MMOs too. It's actually quite incredible to see where the genre kind of grew, like as a foundation, and where many of like the modern day influences and I guess the norms actually sprouted from. Of course, you guys will obviously be familiar with the fact that WoW Classic is like 20 years old by this point, so we aren't exactly comparing apples to apples, but whilst they are very, very different games by comparison, it's no secret that 14 took a lot of influence from WoW during its development and ultimately its redevelopment through the process of ARR, a Realm Reborn. I don't know if this just applies to me or if some of you guys feel the same as well, but you take so much for granted in the modern games such as Final Fantasy 14. Even something as simple as just like getting from point A to point B on the map can just be so trivial in these games if you can teleport and dot about, whereas in a game like WoW Classic, you know, going from A to B can take 20 to 25 minutes, just literally traveling from point to point. Nothing else, no interaction with NPCs, no killing enemies. That is just travel time. And whilst this is like actually fantastic when you are like first starting out, you're exploring the zones, you get into to meet all the new NPCs, new enemies, and you kind of get to like immerse yourself. Like after a while, it can really become a little bit of a sore point because you're just like, oh, dude, I need to, okay, I've got like 4 or 5 quests. I need to go and hand those in at, I don't know, Stone Talon Mountains. Then I've got to go back to Astronar. Then I've got some quests for the Gnomrigan dungeon. I've got to go to Ironforge and hand those in. Dude, if I travel from this point to this point, from like Kalimdor to like Eastern Kingdoms, that is going to take me sometimes like half an hour, 35 minutes, depending if you've not got like ports or you're not buying transportation, which is actually quite wild to think about it. That transport alone in 14 is like basically, I mean, you could do one of your roulettes, maybe even 2 at a push in 14. Do you see how like things have just like sped up so much? Not to mention when I first started WoW Classic, I really enjoyed kind of the like slow pace of things, and I guess because it is just such a shift in dynamic from what I'm used to. But even the travel speed after a while, which, by the way, even when you get to the points of getting a mount, which I think is like 60% extra speed, it still doesn't feel that fast. You know, if you're just running around and, I don't know, I was playing a rogue and a druid, so on my druid I had a 40% speed buff, and then, a 30% speed buff, and then I had sprint on my rogue, so I could kind of get some speed boost in between. When you come back to 14 and you're like, cool, I've discovered this area, I've got this crystal, I can fly, you're like, what? And I'm sure WoW Retail, by the way, for anyone that's played Retail, the reason why I'm not talking about Retail is, again, I've not spent an awful lot of time in it, but I'm sure Retail is the same. You just realize when you jump back into these games just how much you really do take for granted. 14, of course, it does have its elements of exploration. You've got to explore and attune to those crystals before you can transport. But I would argue that one of the main standouts to me whilst playing WoW Classic is quite literally the exploration. The fact that you can revisit multiple zones over and over again, but because you are, I mean, ultimately you've got nothing better to do than just sort of look around. You are taking in the world a bit more, whereas with 14, you just kind of go there once. I mean, I find this, you know, you kind of go there once, the sort of main MSQ takes you to a few sort of designated paths, but then once you've got your crystal, you can just transport yourself, which is great in terms of like ease of use, and it speeds the game up a lot, but it doesn't do wonders for me. Like I personally in this game don't feel the need to go out of my way to explore anything other than to collect like the ether spheres for like flying, basically. Without a shadow of a doubt, though, one of the biggest changes between both games that I noticed was tanking and dungeon content. Like, my God, from WoW Classic to 14, everything is just so different, man. Like, it is so different. In WoW Classic, everything wants to kill you. Like, you step out of line even slightly, everything wants to kill you. If your healer overheals too much and pulls too much aggro, it's definitely going to kill your healer. You know, like if the DPS won't wait 5 minutes for you to get enough aggro, then everything wants to kill you. I think when you add in the brutality of basically facing a wipe and forcing you to run all the way, not just back through the dungeon, but back from your spawn point outside of the dungeon into the dungeon to then spawn into your actual corpse again, that's a lot of travel time. Some of the graveyards that you spawn in when you wipe aren't exactly around the corner from the dungeon, so there is an element of fear going into each dungeon with WoW Classic, which personally, I know some of the content scales quite a lot in 14. There's always been the argument in 14 that there is no real like mid-core content. It's either super easy or super hard, which I think is completely fair. But I do find that in 14 there is no real like danger when you're in a dungeon. You know, maybe if you've got like a healer that's a bit switched off and doesn't really heal the tank like much, or a tank that's a bit overly ambitious sometimes, maybe. But I just feel as when you're a tank, you've just got so much utility, and the healers have got so much flexibility with their mana, whereas like 4 or 5 heals in WoW Classic, you're out of mana basically. I guess in WoW Classic, one thing that you really notice early on is everything is time driven. Everything takes so much time, which is, don't get me wrong, when you're playing a game like that, clearly you've got nothing but time. But even just getting into some of the dungeons, you actually have to fight your way down like predetermined paths or caves, depending on where you are, to actually get into, you know, the boss room. And you don't realize that sometimes I'm playing this game and I think, oh, it'd be really cool if everyone could just like rally around one point, go into looking for a group, explore a dungeon together. But when you've done that a number of times and you've constantly, like in WoW Classic, if you just want to go and do a dungeon, like you are setting yourself up for the day, going to the dungeon to do it with your friends. Like it basically feels like a day out. And after a while, that can get a little bit tedious. So to see the quality of life changes, not just in 14, but in newer games, is we take it for granted so much. I guess in my like humble opinion, I wasn't expecting the early dungeons and pretty much all dungeons I experienced in WoW Classic to be quite as brutal as they were compared to the likes of 14. I feel like 14 really, like, even I would say content even up to max level sometimes doesn't feel particularly difficult. You know, in WoW Classic, you've even got enemies that just patrol behind you, whereas if you're not looking, you know, you can have some really hard-hitting enemies that just walk up behind you and just start absolutely going to town, man. Like, it's crazy. To top off the comparisons and talking about dungeon content and tanking for sure has to be the highlight difference overall that I've noticed with WoW Classic and 14, because WoW Classic, in terms of tanking, it really does feel like you're working a full-time job. You're raising 4 kids. You're still paying child support. And at the end of the day, like, they still get taken off you. Like, it really feels like a job. It's insane how much pressure and stress is involved with tanking in WoW Classic. It is mental. Not only are you just battling with the enemies, but you're also constantly at war with your teammates to ensure that, you know, they're not like shitting AoEs everywhere, making you lose threat. And guess what? Like, if you do lose threat, like, that's on you, buddy. Like, GG, just get better, try harder next time. In 14, it does feel like all you have to do is kind of look at an enemy the wrong way for a little while, and you kind of like just maintain that aggression and threat for the whole time. Like, you could have like most of your DPS just battering the absolute shit out of them, and they're like, you looked at me wrong once and I'll never forget it, and they'll just chase you like for like eternity. It's insane. Once your tank stance is on, you are good to go. Tanking definitely feels a lot more on rails and kind of guided than in WoW Classic, and that's not just like in terms of utility rotation, but that could just be anything from like being able to wall-to-wall pull enemies. Like, the wall-to-wall thing means more in 14 than it does in WoW Classic, because to be honest with you, in WoW Classic you can just run. You could pretty much pull the whole dungeon in one go if you wanted to. You wouldn't survive, but to an extent, depending on what dungeon you're doing, you could just run and take the enemies. Whereas in 14, there were like predetermined sections, like pods, that you've got enemies from A to B, and you can take them all the way up. Some of them you can take them into the boss fight, some of them have got barriers, but it definitely allows you to manage the packs a lot easier. Whereas, like, I don't know, like back in 2004, I swear, like, developers just didn't care. They were like, look, if you want to fuck around and find out, like, feel free. Whereas 14 definitely holds your hand a lot more. It is noticeably a less stressful experience. I don't know, man, it was just really interesting to me because I made a few notes about this and I kind of wanted to talk about it anyway, but I think given the age that I am, being in my 30s, I've experienced like the beginning, the birth of MMOs, even though I didn't sort of directly play them, I grew up with them. And also have experienced kind of this newer age or newer generation, even though 14's been about for a while. And to see those differences kind of meld together and being able to now experience a classic, true representation of World of Warcraft, even though it's not going to be the official launch version, if you like. But just to kind of see the real like glaring differences is just astonishing.